In October 2022, a man known only by his surname Kim was found dead in a Seoul hotel room. He was in his 40s. The police found no signs of foul play, but his death set off a chain reaction that would expose one of the largest financial scandals in South Korean history. And it was the first sign that South Korea's economy was starting to break. Kim had quietly purchased over 1,100 apartments and studios across the Seoul metropolitan area. He had done it with almost none of his own money. Instead, he used a financial mechanism so deeply embedded in Korean life that almost no one outside the country has ever heard of it. A system called Chonse. When Kim died, hundreds of tenants suddenly realized their entire life savings had vanished. Their deposits, often $150,000 or more, had been used to buy more properties in what many would call a real estate Ponzi scheme. The Villa King, as the media came to call him, wasn't an isolated case. He was a symptom of an economy in trouble. South Korea's entire economy is now sitting on a financial system most of the world has never heard of, and it's quietly cracking. Household debt has reached a scale no other developed country has ever tolerated. And the crisis isn't coming, it's already here. To understand why South Korea is in trouble, you have to understand Chonse, because nothing like it exists anywhere else in the world. In most countries, renting works the same way. You pay a security deposit, usually 1 or 2 months of rent, and then you pay rent every month. South Korea has that system too. It's called wolse. But for decades, the main rental arrangement in South Korea was something completely different. Under Chonse, the tenant doesn't pay any monthly rent at all. Instead, they give the landlord a massive lump sum deposit, typically 50 to 80% of the property's market value, and live there rent-free for 2 years. When the lease ends, the landlord returns the full deposit. Let me make this concrete. Imagine an apartment in Seoul worth $580,000. The tenant hands the landlord $365,000 in cash. They pay 0 monthly rent for 2 years. Then they get the full $365,000 back when they move out. To anyone outside of South Korea, this sounds insane. But for nearly a century, it worked fine in South Korea. Here's why. South Korea's banking system in the 1960s and 1970s simply couldn't provide enough mortgages for ordinary people. Chonse solved that problem in a clever way. The tenant got cheap housing without having to pay monthly rent. The landlord got an enormous interest-free loan from the tenant that they could invest however they wanted. When South Korean interest rates were 15% or higher, landlords could earn huge returns just by putting the deposit in a bank. Banks made money on housing loans. Everyone benefited. Chonse helped millions of South Korean families climb from renting to owning within a single generation. Parents save for their children's first Chonse deposit the way American parents save for college tuition. It was, quite literally, the housing engine behind South Korea's economic miracle. But the system depended on 3 conditions that all had to be true at the same time. Property values had to keep rising. Interest rates had to stay high enough that landlords could earn meaningful returns on the deposits. And there had to be a steady stream of new tenants providing fresh deposits to pay back the old ones. As long as all 3 of those conditions held, Chonse functioned beautifully. When any one of them broke, the entire system became unstable. All 3 of them are now breaking at the same time. South Korean home prices climbed relentlessly for 2 decades. In 2025 alone, apartment prices in Seoul rose 13.5%, the steepest gain since 2021. As prices climb, Chonse deposits climb right alongside them. In central Seoul, deposits of 500 million to 1 billion Korean won, between $400,000 and $750,000 became normal. Most tenants couldn't pay these deposits from savings alone, so they borrowed. South Korean banks started offering Chonse loans, often at variable interest rates, using the deposit itself as collateral. By the end of 2025, total household debt in South Korea had reached 1,978 trillion won, nearly 1.5 trillion US dollars. Per borrower household debt hit a record 97.39 million Korean won, the equivalent of 73,000 US dollars for every single person who has a loan. South Korea now has the second highest household debt to GDP ratio in the world at 89.4%. For comparison, the United States sits around 73%. Germany is around 53%. South Korean households also hold 46% of their assets in real estate, a far higher concentration than in almost any other developed economy. When you lock that much of your wealth into housing and you owe nearly as much as your country produces in a year, you have very little room to absorb a shock. Then the shocks came. Mortgage rates rose. Property prices started falling in some segments. The fundamental engine of Chonse, using new deposits to return old deposits, began to stall. Landlords who had used tenant deposits to buy multiple properties suddenly couldn't pay the old tenants back because the new deposits were smaller than the old ones. This is exactly what the Villa King had done, just on a much larger scale. He used tenants' deposits to buy 1,139 properties, betting that prices would keep rising forever. When he died, hundreds of tenants discovered their deposits were gone. Most of them weren't wealthy speculators. They were young couples who had borrowed nearly everything they had to start a life together. The South Korean Supreme Court reported a 60% increase in court cases filed by tenants against landlords for unreturned Chonse deposits. The Bank of Korea estimated that more than half of the 2 million Koreans currently paying Chonse risk losing part or all of their deposits. Here is the part that should worry anyone watching this video from outside South Korea. When tenants lose their Chonse deposits, they don't just lose savings. Most of them lose borrowed savings, the money they took out from banks to pay the deposit in the first place. The bank still needs its money back. The tenant has no way to repay it. The bank takes a loss. Multiply this by hundreds of thousands of cases happening at the same time, and you have the makings of a financial crisis on a scale that could spread far beyond housing. The South Korean government has tried to slow the damage. Authorities restricted some lending rules in October 2025, trying to reduce household debt below the 2,000 trillion won threshold. The Bank of Korea has held interest rates at 2.5%. The Financial Services Commission is considering raising risk requirements on mortgage loans to make banks more cautious. But none of these measures address the underlying problem. South Korean households are more exposed to real estate than households anywhere else on Earth, and the rental system that built that exposure is unraveling. If you're learning something new, consider subscribing. Most of what we cover here never makes the mainstream news, but it probably should. If the housing problem was the only thing happening, South Korea might still be able to absorb the damage, but it's not. There are at least 3 other major pressures hitting the economy at the exact same moment, and they're all making each other worse. The first is national debt. South Korea's national debt reached 1,304 trillion won at the end of 2025. The debt to GDP ratio jumped from 46% to 49% in a single year, the largest increase since the COVID pandemic. Government projections show the number reaching 60% by 2030. The country's governmental flexibility is shrinking at exactly the moment its household sector needs more support to absorb the housing shock. The second is the conflict in the Middle East. South Korea is one of the most energy import-dependent advanced economies on Earth. When the Strait of Hormuz closed in March 2026, oil prices spiked above $120 a barrel. South Korean stocks plunged more than 7% in a single day. The government had to pass an emergency budget of 26.2 trillion won, roughly 17 billion US dollars, just to mitigate the economic fallout. The Bank of Korea has revised its 2026 growth forecast downward, with the central bank now expecting growth to fall short of the modest 2% it projected just a few months earlier. The third pressure is demographic. South Korea has the world's lowest birth rate at 0.72 children per woman. The replacement rate is 2.1. The population is aging faster than any other OECD country. And here's the cruel twist. Fewer young people means fewer new tenants entering the Chonse market. Without that fresh stream of deposits flowing in, landlords can't keep returning the old ones. The demographic collapse and the housing collapse are now feeding each other in a vicious cycle. Fewer babies means fewer future renters, which means fewer deposits, which means more landlord defaults, which means less wealth for the next generation, which makes young people even less likely to start families. And then there's the chaebol risk. 5 family-controlled conglomerates, Samsung, Hyundai, LG, SK, and Lotte, account for nearly 50% of South Korea's entire economy. Samsung alone makes up roughly 20% of GDP. As the chaebol slow hiring, as they've been doing for nearly 3 years now, youth unemployment rises. South Korean unemployment for people in their 20s is now nearly 20%, the highest in the OECD. Young South Koreans can't afford the Chonse deposits to start independent households. So they live with their parents longer. They delay marriage. They don't have children. The economic concentration is amplifying every other problem in the country. South Korea is not the only country that built its modern prosperity on rising home prices and household borrowing. Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, and Sweden all followed similar paths. In each case, low interest rates inflated property values, households borrowed against rising wealth, and the broader economy became dependent on continued home price growth. South Korea's story is the same pattern with one critical difference. The Chonse system added an additional layer of fragility that no other country has. When Chonse fails, it doesn't just hurt homeowners. It wipes out the savings of tenants, ordinary people who never owned property, never wanted speculative exposure to real estate, and were just trying to find a place to live. We've covered this pattern playing out across the world on this channel. Australia's $12 trillion housing trap, Canada's quiet decline driven by housing dependency and trade exposure, the central bank backstop that propped up housing markets globally for 15 years and is no longer there. South Korea is what happens when you stack all of these vulnerabilities on top of a unique financial mechanism that magnifies every shock. For the rest of the world, South Korea is a preview. The country had every advantage: world-class manufacturing, cutting-edge technology, an educated and disciplined workforce, strong institutions. None of that was enough to prevent what's happening now. When the housing engine stalled, the entire economy became fragile. If South Korea can fall into this trap with all of its strengths, no country built on the same foundation should consider itself safe. South Korea built its modern economy on a unique financial system that worked beautifully for half a century. Chonse housed the country, fueled the economic miracle, and helped millions of families build wealth out of nothing. But it depended on conditions that no longer exist: rising prices, high interest rates, and an endless stream of new tenants. All three have broken at once. The Villa King's death wasn't just the end of one man's scheme, it was the moment the cracks in the entire system became visible. The question now isn't whether more will follow, it's how long the country has before the entire structure collapses on itself.